por parte de los inversores. Bueno, y con esto vamos a seguir hablando de renta fija, de bonos. Lo vamos a hacer con Jim Cielinski, que es responsable global de renta fija en Janus Henderson Investors. Jim, good afternoon. Thank you for being in Negocios Televisión.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
We're going to speak today about global public debt, which increased by 7.6% to reach an all-time high of 62.2 trillion in 2022. Is this something to worry about, Jim?
It is, and I think it's one of the most kind of under-recognized risks that's out there. It's not just the amount of debt that keeps climbing, it's the payments on the debt. The combination of that, I think, has made the debt load, in many cases, begin to look unsustainable. And I think this is quite important for a lot of financial markets, not just bonds.
Now we have seen, Jim, the consequences for the banking sector of the raise in interest rates by the central banks. But having these levels of global public debt, will we ever have something similar but in the sovereign debt market due to the high levels of debt and the rise in interest rates?
I don't know that I'd anticipate a crisis of the same type. I think it's more likely that you just divert more and more of your resources to paying the interest bill. And I think as that happens, what you get is a slower natural rate of growth. And so I think the crisis that we saw maybe over the last 20 years was often because we didn't have the backstop. We didn't have the framework. We didn't have the tools. I think we have a much better understanding of those, and that will perhaps stop the crisis at the sovereign level. But what happens, though, is that the rate has to adjust. So you may not get those same fears that countries can't repay, but what you do get are weaker currencies, you get higher interest rates, and I think that's part of what you're seeing today. We got here, it takes a while to get to where we have, but there is a lot of debt out there. And with each crisis, we've seen a big step change. And since the pandemic, that number that you mentioned is 25% higher than pre-COVID. And you saw similar increases in 2008, you saw a similar but a slightly smaller increase in the Eurozone debt crisis. The market, though, until this particular episode, has never really penalized the countries for borrowing so much. And this kind of is what is different this time. You're now starting to see markets really understand this debt dynamic and start to penalize countries that don't have a good handle on their sovereign debt risk.
Jim, how should we react in our portfolios to movements in the fixed income markets like the movements we're seeing now?
Well, I think be nimble. When you get regime shifts like this and when central banks are tightening, volatility is high. So first of all, recognize that things will move a lot in the short term. Keep an eye on the long term is what I would say. Recognize that bonds, and this includes short-term bonds and even cash, they now serve a legitimate role in a broader portfolio that maybe they didn't a few years ago. Higher rates, better valuations, all these things I think make bonds a much better tool to help navigate the volatility. It does not mean that interest rates keep going up and up and up. What it does do is create that secular backdrop. By slowing the economy, that is, on the other hand, good for bonds. So I think you have a cyclical argument for bonds right now that is actually quite positive. I think central banks globally will be reaching their peak in the next few months. And with the higher rates and the higher income, and I think better diversifying capabilities, I think bonds actually look attractive. So we'd stick with high quality. The chance of a slowdown is very real. With high rates, you don't need to stretch as much as you used to. So, we like bonds and we like high quality bonds, even though the debt load will continue to escalate from here.
You said in a report, governments must undergo a painful exercise as record debt and rising interest rates mean borrowing costs will double over the next 3 years. That's what you said. What should governments do, in your opinion, as you said that they're going to undergo this painful exercise?
Well, I think number one, they're going to have to keep running big deficits. There's just no easy way to step back from that. But as you say, the interest bill is about 1.4 trillion US dollar last year. It's probably double that by 2025. And what that means is for a given level of expenditure, governments have to spend on the contractual elements. That leaves, I think, first of all, less to spend elsewhere. And importantly, it also leaves less of a toolkit available if we run into trouble or get another pandemic, another deep recession, things like that. So a larger and larger percentage of the capital in economies will be diverted to just paying interest bills. That can be good for savers. It typically, though, creates some real pinch points, I think, in other areas that often are better for helping productivity. And this, again, is why economies with this higher debt load and higher interest bill probably have a slower kind of natural pace of growth from this point forward. So governments are in a really difficult spot, and that's true everywhere. In Europe, we have obviously fiscal frameworks that further impose some of those rules, but it's going to be a really tough go for, I think, a lot of countries as they find that they can't spend on all the programs they wanted to spend on. Instead, they're going to have to be paying the interest bill because you can't back away from that.
Jim Cielinski, responsable global de renta fija en Janus Henderson Investors. Jim, thank you so much for being in Negocios Televisión. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Mientras tanto, nosotros